season, unending pain and tears. Use our anger to melt the swords of hate. Use our tears to water thirsty ground. Give us courage to love all you create. Come to us and turn your world around. Come to us and turn your world around. Use our anger to melt the swords of hate. Use our tears to water thirsty ground. Give us courage to love all you create. Come to us and turn this world around. Come to us and turn the world around. Our hearts are breaking, our fury shaking, our souls are tired, our breath is gone. We cry, how long, Lord, this evil season, unending pain and tears.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you could join us in this first service of our summer season. Let's start, since we can't be in person and in the sanctuary, can we all wave at each other just so that we know we're here? This is somewhat of a substitute for a hug this morning. Although I don't know why anyone would want to hug on a morning like this. It's too hot for my taste. But we're going to sort of be very casual about how we handle things. This is a summer service after all. There are certain elements in the service that we're keeping, but some we'll save for those special times when we get together again in September. But this officially is the welcome and announcements, and welcome on this Sunday morning, June 21st. The announcement list is very short because, after all, it's summertime. First of all, if you would like to see what First Parish is doing during the summer, please go to the First Parish website, www.uubedford.org, and look up the schedule, and there are lots of Zoom meetings and other activities for the kids. Please feel free to join those and enjoy them. Also, the COVID testing Tuesdays continue this Tuesday, the 23rd. All are welcome. And if you would like to come, they encourage that you sign up ahead of time. To pre-register, you'd send our very own John Gibbons an email. His email is jgibbons@uubedford.org, and he'll send you the link to register. Next Sunday morning, with UUs all around the country and around the world, we'll join the online Sunday worship at the UUA Sunday Assembly, UUA Sunday worship at the UUA General Assembly. Something like that, you get it. Watch your email this week for details. John will be the one hosting that service, and everyone can check in early, and then we can join those you use in this country and, as I said, around the world, and worship together. This service is open to all, and I'm very happy that all of you are here. So for our next thing in the service, we're going to do the unison affirmation. If you would like to stand as you're able, you can. I will recite it, and you can recite it with me. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor, y ayudamos los unos a los otros. Now we move to our offering. Since the presentation this morning is about music, I have made the decision that the offertory will be a moment of meditation. So while we take 30 seconds to meditate, to ponder our thoughts, I would like to encourage everyone to continue to give to First Parish and the works of First Parish, because this community is a generous community, and we want it to be able to continue not only during the church year, but throughout the summer. And now I'd like to ask Dean Groves to start his presentation. Again, this is our first summer service. The name of the presentation is With Joy We Claim the Growing Light. And frankly, I don't think I need say anymore, because I think we're going to let Dean do what he needs to do.
Okay, so I'm going to present one of the hymns in our gray hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, in a somewhat different way today. It's number 345, With Joy We Claim the Growing Light. This text was written in 1875 by Samuel Longfellow, whose brother Henry was a famous poet. In fact, Samuel was referred to as brother of the poet so often that eventually he accepted that epithet with good graces. But he was a fine poet himself, and he's now known primarily for his hymns. So first I'm going to sing the hymn, and you'll see the text up on the screen. Then I'll talk about the seismic changes in Unitarian theology that were occurring in Samuel Longfellow's lifetime, which he witnessed, and also Samuel's connection to famous Unitarians of the day. Then I'll sing the hymn again. And this technique I've heard referred to as a hymn sandwich. So I hope you find it nourishing and interesting. So can we have the slide now, please?
We can.
Okay. Here's how it goes. With joy we claim the growing light, advancing thought and widening view, the larger freedom, clearer sight, which from the old unfold the new. With wider view come loftier goal, with fuller light more good to see, with freedom truer self-control, with knowledge deeper reverence be. All right, so let's take down the slide. That sounds a lot like some of the other hymns in the gray hymnal, right? It's just what you'd want in a hymn, short and sweet, positive and uplifting. But where did these specific concepts come from? Can you imagine a time in which terms like advancing thought, wider view, and larger freedom would be considered radical? And what does "from the old unfold the new" mean? Let's put the author and the text in a historical context. Now, three of the most influential Unitarian reformers of the 19th century were William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Theodore Parker. They all raised prophetic voices, which caused shockwaves in the established religion of the time and helped to define Unitarianism as we know it today, Unitarian Universalism as we know it today. In the early 1800s in New England, there was a growing theological conflict within the Congregational Church between Orthodox and liberal ministers. Orthodox ministers held fast to Calvinist beliefs that were brought to America with the Puritans. They believed that all people are inherently sinful and unworthy to go to heaven unless saved by God, and God has already decided who will be saved and who will not. They believe the only way anyone can know if they will be saved is through an intense experience of revelation and repentance known as a conversion. These ministers' sermons were typically filled with dramatic images that inspired fear and awe in hopes of bringing about such a conversion. The liberal ministers did not trust emotional appeals. They studied the Christian Bible and found it did not support Calvinist orthodoxy. They believed that God is loving rather than tyrannical, having given people the powers of reason and conscience to enable them to choose right from wrong. And they believed all people can redeem themselves by living a virtuous life. Liberal ministers would preach about duty and responsibility rather than fear and repentance. Now, most importantly, liberal ministers came to reject the concept of the Holy Trinity, believing that God is one entity, not three. This schism grew so severe that Orthodox ministers stopped exchanging their pulpits with liberal ministers, and Orthodox members of churches that chose liberal ministers began leaving to form their own congregations. In 1819, the year Samuel Longfellow was born, William Ellery Channing delivered a sermon in Baltimore entitled Unitarian Christianity. Unitarianism already existed in England. The Orthodox congregational ministers of New England often flung the epithet Unitarian at liberal ministers in disdain. The liberal faction decided to declare their theology in a formal public way, snatching the pejorative label from the Orthodox faction and claiming it as their own. Channing's sermon ignited the conflict between Orthodox and liberal ministers. It was immediately published as a pamphlet to huge success. Many congregations, especially in eastern Massachusetts, continued to split along theological lines, as did the Bedford Church in 1831 and 1832. Within 2 decades of the sermon's delivery, 1/4 of the standing order churches in Massachusetts had openly declared themselves as Unitarian. Now, Samuel Longfellow's father was a Harvard classmate of Channing. As Samuel grew from youth to manhood, he witnessed the first flowering of American Unitarianism from a front row seat. In the 1830s, a growing faction of Unitarian ministers in Samuel's generation, now this is the generation after Channing, was becoming dissatisfied with the prevailing view that the fundamental way of knowing God is through reason. They began to move in a direction that emphasized the intuitive, mysterious nature of personal spiritual experience. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the most prominent spokesperson for this theological perspective, which came to be known as American Transcendentalism. Its proponents believe that God exists within every person, and that connection with God can be achieved without the assistance of any formal religion. Some remained in ministry, and some broke their ties with Unitarianism altogether. Emerson entered Harvard Divinity School at the age of 22 in 1825 and became a minister of the prestigious Second Church of Boston in 1829, but left parish ministry just 4 years later. He published his first book, Nature, in 1836, which launched a new career for him as a writer and lecturer. With a group of friends, Emerson established a forum for discussing new viewpoints on religion and society, which came to be known as the Transcendental Club, and met between 1836 and 1840. This group grew to include many of the most progressive thinkers of the day, such as Bronson Alcott, Elizabeth Peabody, Margaret Fuller, James Freeman Clarke, and Henry David Thoreau. The ideas promoted by this group inspired many people in Emerson's day, and not just Unitarians. Now, Samuel Longfellow, author of the hymn and brother of the poet, graduated Harvard at the age of 20 in 1839. Just a year earlier, Emerson had been invited by graduating seniors to give an address. In that speech, he criticized 2 major tenets of contemporary Unitarian theology, and so offended and angered the faculty that they did not invite him to speak there again for almost 30 years. Nevertheless, Emerson and the Transcendentalists had a profound effect on Samuel's generation of Unitarian ministers. Now, Samuel entered Harvard Divinity School in 1842. He and his classmate Samuel Johnson, who became known as the 2 Sams, were deeply influenced by Emerson and the Transcendentalists. They wrote hymns together, weaving into their texts the newfound transcendental theology. They produced the 1846 Book of Hymns, and many of their hymns are included in Singing the Living Tradition. And lastly, Theodore Parker, one of the most radical theologians of that day, finished his divinity school courses at age 26 in 1836 and was ordained minister of the West Roxbury Unitarian Church the next year. He was soon noticed around Boston for the quality of his sermons, but his theology was moving in an increasingly controversial direction. Parker's ideas were consonant with those of Transcendentalism. He attended meetings of the Transcendental Club and contributed many articles and reviews to the most important Transcendentalist periodical, The Dial. He enthusiastically listened to Emerson deliver the Divinity School address in 1838. Its prophetic tone inspired Parker to begin preaching on church and social reform. In his sermon, A Discourse of the Transient and Permanent in Christianity, delivered in 1841, Parker talked about absolute religion and spiritual truths that would be valid for all time, that is, permanent. At the same time, he denied the validity of the trappings of religion, which are transient, including, importantly, the Bible miracle stories. At the same time, yes, I said that, Samuel Longfellow was an enthusiastic supporter of Parker. Hearing him preach with admiration and taking his side in the controversy that he was stirring up, Parker is always referred to as Theodore in Longfellow's contemporary letters, in which he gushed about how marvelous Parker was. Parker, for his part, liked to refer to the book of hymns as the Sam book. So Longfellow had close connections with all three of these prophets. Now let's take a closer look at the text of the hymn. Can we bring the slide back up, please? Okay. So in this text, the old clearly is the established prevailing theology, and the new is the radical movement seeking to change it. In Channing's day, Unitarianism in America was radical to Orthodox Congregationalists. In Emerson and Parker's day, transcendentalism and absolute religion were radical to other Unitarians. And the first stanza describes aspects of the new thinking. Advancing thought is a new way of understanding and studying religion. Widening view is a perspective not reliant on doctrine or scripture for inspiration, in which revelation is not sealed. And larger freedom is the ability of every individual to seek a path, a unique path to enlightenment. So Samuel Longfellow had a long career as a preacher and hymn writer, and he never lost his progressive evangelism. He wrote this text at the age of 67, just as old as I am now, and believe me, that's old. I believe he is looking back fondly on the momentous decades of his youth and praising the movement from old to new itself. This process of continual radical reinvention is a cornerstone of our religious history and of our religious practice today. In Theodore Parker's words, it makes us outgrow any form or any system of doctrines we have developed and approach still closer to the truth. It would lead us to take what help we can find. Now let's go back to the text and I'll sing it one more time. With joy we claim the growing light, advancing thought and widening view, the larger freedom, clearer sight, which from the old enfold the new. With wider view come loftier goal, with fuller light more good to see. With freedom truer self-control, with knowledge deeper reverence be. Okay. So I hope this bit of historical context has served to illuminate what I believe is a wonderfully compact manifesto for progressive change. And I hope it inspires you to look deeply into the history of our faith that's embedded into the texts of our living tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. That was excellent. So we're going to, rather than do breakout rooms, and since we're a smaller group this morning, we're going to do question and answers. And I'd like to ask the first question of Dean. Uh, and Dean, why were you inspired to do the presentation this morning? What got you thinking that this is what you would like to present?
Well, I took an online course sponsored by the AUUMM, the Association of Unitarian Universalist Music Ministries, which used to be called the UU Musicians Network. It was a pilot of a module that was called Unitarian Universalist History for Musicians. And this was the first time I had been exposed to this approach of understanding hymns in their historical context. And I really loved it. It's sort of a missing piece in my own practice. And I think that it's a really cool thing. So we had we were asked to choose a final project, and most of it was the things that we chose. There were about 10 students in the course, and we chose something like this, something in many cases related to RE, because a lot of the attendees, I was the only attendee in the course that is not a professional, either a music director, an RE director, or a staff music leader. And so they all started immediately throwing up proposals for projects which were like, a 7-week course online with multimedia and, and references and all this stuff. And I thought, well, I need to do something simple. And I wanted to orient it towards the immediate experience of the hymn itself. And I guess I have a question for everyone, which is, was the experience of hearing it after hearing the history any different for you? And if so, in what way? Because that essentially is what I'm looking for. So that's how I got to this. That's the answer.
Good. So for this question and answer time, what we're allowing everyone to do is to mute and unmute yourself. So if you have a question for Dean, could you unmute yourself, and then when you're finished with your question, immediately mute yourself back. Does anyone have a specific question for Dean that they'd like to ask? I see Melinda's got her physical hand raised, so just unmute yourself, Melinda.
Thanks. Yeah, the host has to unmute. Dean, that was absolutely wonderful. And I want to just thank you so much both for the insight around how those hymns were created and contextualizing it for us. And yes, it was different after hearing the context that you provided. A quick question for you. I found the hymn really timely and relevant. I'm curious, there are so many hymns from which to choose, and I expect the SAM book has many. I'm interested in how you happened to find that hymn, how it spoke to you, and whether there were competitors, like the top 3 that you were thinking about or whatever when you were doing your work.
Well, yes, there were, and there were a lot of suggestions provided by the course leaders. They had it was a 7-week course, and each week there was a different set of readings and material that is actually available on the UU website in various areas. And they chose some hymns that were either written by the historical figures that they were talking about, or spoke to the relevant topics of the session. So I picked that one pretty much because it was short, and I sort of latched on to the concepts of it pretty early on. It spoke to me in that way of being very, very elliptical and abstract to the point where it's applicable across a wide variety of situations. And then as I studied it, I realized that, oh, yes, this is what he's talking about. So that's kind of how it went.
Great, thank you.
And I see that Dorothy Africa has her hand up next.
Okay. Dean, I was wondering, yes, it does make a tremendous difference, to answer your question first, between the first hearing and the second. I was wondering if you could, as a musician, say something too about the music itself, those old Lutheran processional kind of plain chant hymn groundings. They do have that kind of steady, resolute forward march kind of sound to them. I wondered if you looked into the music itself at all, or just the text.
I didn't look into the music, but as I noted on the slide, it was originally published in 1690 in Germany in something called Musikalisches Handbuch, the musical handbook. And this was common in the time for composers to write tunes that were that had the certain kind of rhythm that was present in hymnody, in hymn texts, and it was very common to exchange tunes and texts interchangeably. You'll see some symbols in the hymn book in the lower right-hand section of the hymns, some of which refer to how many feet there are in the poetic lines, and so you can match them up that way. That's been going on for a long time. Now, here's the extra credit question for you. Does anybody recognize the tune of this hymn? Because there is another text for this tune.
Well, then unmute yourself.
Recognize it, but I can't tell you what it is.
Isn't it joyful, joyful, we adore, da, da, da? No?
No?
No, that's the Ode to Joy. Yeah. Yes, who said that?
John.
John, yes, John's got it. Okay.
So go ahead and repeat that, Dean, so we can all hear it.
Almost 60 years later, a hymn writer named Marion Franklin Ham was asked to come up with a hymn to celebrate or commemorate the growing interest between Unitarians and Universalists of joining more formally. They had had sort of informal relationship up to that point, but this was in 1933. He wrote the hymn As Tranquil Streams, and it took until the 60s for it to be formalized, but they were thinking about it decades earlier. So that's an interesting example of how, as I like to say, the best tunes never die, and this one was good enough for Longfellow, and was also good enough for Ham to choose for As Tranquil Streams.
I'm wondering
So,
if you
Marjorie, you're next.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I found this fascinating, and I wondered, Dean, if you could recommend a text that might have some of those sermons and speeches that you alluded to, sort of the classic historical texts.
They're available on the UU website, and I can, what I could do is I could trace back the specific links from the course and sort of offer a top level link to those materials. There's a lot of biographical material and historical material on what was going on in those days on the website. And that's where a lot of these training modules take their content from.
Thank you.
Bob and Alona, I know you've had your hand up for quite a while. Can you unmute yourself?
I believe I'm unmuted.
You are.
When our son AJ was an undergrad at University of Virginia, he took a course, I believe, in storytelling, in which he did a paper on comparative lyrics to the same hymn. He was guided by Jack Mendelson at that time, who told him which hymns to look for. And one of the things that he discovered is that various Protestant branches use different stanzas from the same poems. That in a congregational hymnal, they might select these three, and a Lutheran might select a different one. And the Unitarians almost invariably selected different stanzas from the hymn. I wish he were here to expand on that. But I thoroughly enjoyed what you're doing, and yes, it changed my appreciation for the hymn.
Well, thank you for sharing that. In fact, this hymn, the text of this hymn did originally appear as stanzas 2 and 3 of a larger text, which in the first, second, and fifth stanza, no, the first, fourth, and fifth stanza has a lot more God stuff in it. So you hit the nail right on the head. It happened a lot, and it's still happening a lot. And Samuel Longfellow in particular, or the two Sams, both of them, employed this technique a lot. They reimagined, to use a modern term, existing hymns and oriented towards their new transcendentalist perspective. In fact, doing what the hymn says, from the old unfolding the new. So this is an example of one example of doing that as well.
So I would like to show you what Dean was talking about with hymns and the meters, the feet of the hymns, and etc. In that I have a copy of Singing the Living Tradition right here. And I'm going to pick a favorite hymn of John's, which is the Sweet June Days. And if you'll notice, at the bottom of the page, the first page, it's across 2 pages, there is right there, can you see the CMD? Do you see that?
Move it a little bit.
Yep.
Okay. So what you've got there is, this is for someone who's done lots of different churches and worked his whole life in as a church musician. What happens is you've got Forest Green. Forest Green, of course, the tune is ba da 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 da, right? You've got that. Well, for many religions, it's not Sweet June Days. It's other tunes, it's other words. And so what happens is you can actually go through the hymn book, and if you look at that CMD, and you can find all the different poems that have CMD on them, and you can interchange all those tunes with each other. And so, in fact, last week, John picked a hymn that we sang to the tune of Good King Wenceslas. And in the hymn book, it is not set to that tune, but the meter is the same as Good King Wenceslas. And it turns out that Sue likes Good King Wenceslas better, so we switched to the more familiar tune. So you can do that. The hymn books are actually a really great device for switching things around. I've done it to you during Sunday morning services, and it drives everyone crazy because I tell you not to look at the tune, but to sing the words. So anyway, let's, are there any other questions? Lois and Brown, I see Lois waving, and I see that you're already unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We
Can
can.
you hear me? I was going to say, having been brought up as a Methodist, I sang different words to a lot of hymns that I've been singing ever since I've been a Unitarian with new words. First, I want to say, I hope, Dean, you do this again, maybe next summer. I loved this service, and I loved your explanation about that hymn. I always read myself, and I suspect many of us do, who wrote the music and who wrote the words every time we sing a hymn.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it fascinating, that we can get some really interesting messages from some hymns and from some we can't. Years ago in 1973, Dot and Dick Ellison Brown and I went to London on a Tufts University cheap trip. And one of the plays we saw was called Lloyd George Was My Father. I can't tell you who wrote it now, I'd have to look it up. But ever since seeing that play, because of what it was about, I remember that the famous song Onward Christian Soldiers, which of course I grew up knowing, and we have it in our hymn book with other words. In the British play we saw, it was Lloyd George was my father was Lloyd George, which proves you can put anything to anything. So what we've all said about hymns, I think has been fascinating, and I hope we do it again. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lois. The other, I'll add one thing to the story of Onward Christian Soldiers, and this proves that you can do an awful lot to change the meaning, slapping different words on a tune. I think that's the tune that was, this might not have been the correct hymn, but there was a hymn that is in our book that was also used by the Nazis in the Third Reich, Deutschland über alles. Is that the same one?
It is.
Yes, and that was deliberate on the part of the Nazis to appropriate that old hymn for their purposes.
No, that's Österreicher hymn.
Yeah, well, that particular hymn was written by Franz Joseph Haydn. It's been around a lot longer than the Nazis. And
the tune?
The tune had been around for since the 1790s.
Yeah.
And it had been the former hymn tune that had been used as the German national anthem was the same hymn tune that is still presently used as the English national anthem, which we happen to know as "My Country, 'Tis of Thee, God Save Our Gracious Queen." That was the anthem of Germany up through Nazi Germany, and then they appropriated the Haydn tune, which had already been used in American hymn books since probably about the 1840s, and so we got that association with it, and we've been trying to overcome that association ever since, because it's Haydn's tune. It's not the Nazi tune.
Wasn't it associated with Austria?
The Austrians had they had used it for God Protect the Kaiser. But again, it had been dropped after World War I. So it had gone away sort of into mothballs until the Nazis resurrected it sometime in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So
a couple more raised hands, I think.
Yes, I see that Craig, you actually, you have your hand up. Hold on, let's unmute you. There you go, Craig.
I had two questions. First of all, I think, Brad, you should explain what those letters mean, because I find it fascinating, and it's because so often you see numbers there instead.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, a question for Dean, is to what extent did 20th century music come into this course, in either early 20th century or late 20th century?
I think that the music that was spotlighted by the course leaders was not what you'd call 20th century, in a sense that it was stuff that was already in the hymnal. They didn't choose anything that was not in Singing the Living Tradition. Well, actually, they did choose some that was in Singing the Journey. Right. And especially in the part where we were talking about problems with the racial problems that occurred leading right up to the to the union of the two faiths in the civil rights era. So I would say it was pretty much limited to our hymnals, and that's was some informal discussion about that, and that I heard someone say that, you know, the hymn texts are pretty much as close to UUs get to having scripture at all, and that and some of these famous sermons that have been delivered that were so instrumental in changing the course of evolution of our faith. So I think that it was definitely appropriate for this particular module to focus on what's in the hymnals. But there wasn't a lot of stuff that like, you know, popular music or modern classical music or anthems of the modern world.
So I think there was quite a bit in Singing the Living Tradition, that even like from Clarice Patton's father, there was a number of, you know, first half and then like the Carolyn McDade stuff in the second half of the 20th century.
Yep, and there was a deliberate attempt to bring in music of other cultures and traditions as well. When they created the edition we use now, which was what was it, 92 or 95? It was put out.
So one of the things I'd like to demonstrate this idea of switching hymns. There is a hymn in our hymn book called "Come, O Sabbath Day." We don't really use that hymn. I think we've used it once in all the years that I've been at First Parish. It's right here. There's the first line. The tune of the hymn happens to be "Come, O Sabbath Day, and bring peace and healing on the wing." Okay, so that particular meter happens to be the same as "Come, O Sabbath Day, and bring peace and healing on the wing." Recognize that tune? "Angels we have heard on high." So you can really use the hymn book if you really decide to be creative. You can use it any number of ways. But let's see, does anyone else have a question? So Don, you're unmuted, so go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, the hymns as we know them are are always to piano or organ. Are there also instances of hymns which were written particularly for other instruments?
Have you noticed in both Singing the Living Tradition and in the Teal hymnal, have you noticed that some of the hymns don't have any harmonies? It basically just has a melodic line. That's in order to not only allow pianists or organists to make up their own harmonies or have music directors get creative, but it's also so that an indication that they can be done on other instruments, especially guitar, that a guitarist can lead it. And in fact, as we've done many times at First Parish, and Dean's been involved in that, as soon as John or Annie or Deb has come to me and said, we'd like to do a particular hymn, and I see that it's one of those, I normally ask Dean and or Buffy to help us by leading those particular hymns from guitar rather than from piano. It's not that you can't play it on a keyboard, but the composer has indicated that they would prefer it be led in a slightly different manner. So that's how you know. Also, Don, you had asked me, and then I'll get to Vern and Vicky. Don, you had asked me about the hymn Faith of Our Fathers. Don, after I sent out my announcement on Friday, had responded, why don't we do Faith of Our Fathers anymore? Because we all like the national hymn. That's the name of the tune, with that bum, ba 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 bum, 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 bum. And basically, as Unitarians, as I explained to him, the text is very patriarchal. It's very much of its time. Someone tried to assuage that a bit, and they wrote another text called God of the Ages, which for some Unitarians is also a problematic text. So what it is, we have done that particular hymn once at First Parish since I've been here for 15 years, because I had enough brass that I told John Gibbons, who was preaching that morning, I said, can we do this hymn? And his sermon that morning was about our heritage. So that way we could sing Faith of Our Fathers in context, and it made sense. But it's not in our hymn book. So Vern and Vicky, can you unmute yourselves and ask your question?
Well, can you hear me?
We can.
Not so much a question, but a comment, and sort of went out of an editorial in a paper down here in Falmouth about how come the Unitarian churches own most of the prime real estate in many, many towns. And the answer is that during that ferment, the early first congregational, usually church, often became Unitarian. In the case of Falmouth, it was dependent on the minister. And as the ferment, as it were, was going along in the 1830s, the minister became a conservative Congregationalist, and the Unitarian denomination for a while died out. But the thing that I was thinking more germane to this conversation is how powerful well-written music or powerfully written music can be, and that you can take that piece of music, capture the mind, and hook any message you want to it, and things go all kinds of different directions.
Good
Well said.
Yep.
Yep. And you can see it's a tool that can be used for good or evil. So let's use it for good, shall we?
So I see that Abby and Alan have made a comment, asked a question. And Sharon McDonald, can you unmute yourself? Because I'm going to ask you some questions that you know. So they have asked, Abby and Alan asked, isn't that meaning when we have just the tune in the hymn book? Isn't that what the old string bass was for, to provide the tune for hymns rather than an organ? So Sharon, do you want to talk about how hymns were done at First Parish before the organ came in? The organ came in 1888, right?
Yeah.
And then before that, how did First Parish sing hymns? Do you remember what the accompaniment was? I can answer that, but I thought I'd bring you in on that.
Well, there was a melodeon before that, and there were clarinets and violins and all sorts of things that it was in the 1830s that the First Parish got the Prescott bass. Go ahead, you talk.
Dean, do you want to expand on that? Because you commented to Abby that the bass was used for reinforcing the bass line, but go ahead and expand on that.
Well, that's really it. I presume that this was a habit or a convention that emerged because a lot of churches didn't have many instruments, or maybe no instruments at all. And one of the simplest things you could do to make things sound more impressive was to reinforce the bass line. And I think it probably indicates that not all churches had much in the way of power in the bass section of the choir, but because the congregation would be singing the melody only, no matter what there was in terms of a harmony. So to anchor the melody in some kind of harmonic context, the most important part is the bass, to give you an idea of where the tonality is. That's a technique that's taught in composition. And then other parts and other voices can elaborate on the harmony, but I think the most important part, other than the melody, is the bass line, traditionally. So it was the first type of instrument that a lot of churches would choose in order to enhance congregational singing.
And because the church was not heated, Mr. Hosmer, who was the bass player, used to have to take that bass home with him every week and then bring it back.
And we think it's bad just getting it from the sanctuary to Annie's office. The other thing I'd like to bring up as a church musician who's worked for many religions, there's also in certain religions the idea of no instruments at all, or only certain instruments, meaning still to this day, there are religions that think keyboards are one of the devil's instruments, which means I'm going straight to hell for that, but that's okay. And they will allow a clarinet, but they won't allow a flute for whatever reason. They'll allow a string bass, but they won't allow a bass guitar. I mean, a lot of that's fallen away, but in the Church of the Nazarene, they still do not allow any instruments whatsoever. And I have worked in a Nazarene church a couple of times, and what I find so interesting about that particular community is when it gets to the hymn, basically what happens is you stand up, you give the congregation a single tone, and they start singing the hymn in 4-part harmony a cappella, no matter how many verses. A lot of times they do the same hymn over and over, so many of them have it memorized, but it is one of the most amazing sounds ever to have a congregation singing in 4-part harmony just because someone stood up in front and gave a pitch. We don't do that, and many congregations don't, but I respect them for doing that, although I disagree with them about using instruments during worship services. So John, you can unmute yourself and lower your hand.
I will do so. This has been just great, Dean and Brad, and it's sort of the best of having a presentation and a talk back all at once, and it has been wonderful. So thank you all. I do want to make one comment about with joy we claim the growing light hymn, in that it contributed in part to the reputation that Unitarians have often had of being an overly optimistic and positive faith, and sometimes underestimating more difficult emotions or darker points of view. I remember that when I first candidated for the ministry in Bedford, one somewhat crotchety parishioner stared me down and said, "Are you one of those people that have a bluebird theology?" Meaning, is it all happy talk for you and optimism? And that sometimes is the rap that can be hung around the neck of Unitarian Universalists, that we can underestimate evil and pain and darkness. And I think in some of the work that's going on in current hymnody, there's an attempt to address a fuller range of things. And I just would take note of the line in the hymn that says, with fuller light, more good to see. Well, some would say balderdash, with more light, you will see, things that you may not want to see. And particularly when we're going through crises of the sorts that we're going through right now, be it political or pandemic or racial rebellion and strife, we're seeing things that we have not wanted to see. And I think that that's a challenge for our faith to acknowledge that there are some very painful realities that we face, and that we're not in a direct lineage of progressivism and onward and upward forever. That used to be sort of the Unitarian mantra, the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. Well, once again, balderdash. It doesn't always work out that way. But I think that this was a great way to initiate this conversation. So again, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you for comments. I'll offer a short rejoinder to that. I noticed that about this text, and I thought to myself, well, I went a little bit one layer deeper into the idea, and I thought, yes, everyone who has their eyes open and of course and their mind open and their heart open realizes that we have all range of experiences in front of us. I think what that text is saying, it's interesting. I think what it's saying about what is not the part of the growing light is in not saying it, it's implying that it must be there. How do we know that something is better than something that has gone before? And we have to compare it by some sort of yardstick. And I think that what, in a sense, the text is saying is that we are filled with joy because there is the opportunity for this expansion and widening and progression and movement. It might be a stretch, but I think that it's not to say that that's the only way of looking at the world, but I think it is to say that this is the part of life that gives us the greatest joy. So.
Those are good words, Dean. So we're going to close this up. I'm going to ask Dean to give sort of the last word on this, in that Dean was the one who selected both the prelude and the postlude. Dean, could you tell us a little about what inspired you, if anything, about either of the two pieces that you'd like to share before we go into the postlude?
Actually, the other thing I wanted to say in rejoinder to John's comment was that Mark Miller's lament really goes a very long way towards doing what you're describing, which is to raise, to amplify and bring to the forefront of our consciousness the depth of the darkness of our experience, and that's very important and powerful in and of itself. I got a notice on the AUUMM general discussion forum right after Mark Miller posted it to that forum, and I immediately forwarded it to Brad because I thought it was amazingly powerful. And I had also heard the postlude first from a posting by Amanda Udis Kessler. Amanda having released that. So it's been, for me, it's been a kind of a mother lode for this stuff, to sort of hear what people are doing now, as well as things that people really like and that they want to share.
So what we will do is we're now going to go into the postlude. After the postlude is over, we'll keep this open, and everyone will be able to unmute themselves and just chat in a disorganized way, just like a regular coffee hour, or if you want to sign off, you can. But let's close with this postlude. Hold on just a moment.
Filled with fear, laden with sadness, chaos and madness grow around us. Still we're here, risking and daring, endlessly caring. Hope has found us. Peace surrounds us. We were called for just such a time as this. For this time we were made. We give all our love and compassion, trust into action, even afraid. We were called for just such a time as this, and we make this vow. We'll bring all our gifts to the table, do what we're able somehow. For we were called for just such a time as now. Touched by grief, stressed and exhausted, counting the losses, sorrow hounds us still again. We are invited, gently reminded, faith has found us. Grace astounds us. We were called for just such a time as this. For this time we were made. We give all our love and compassion, trust into action, even afraid. We were called for just such a time as this, and we make this vow. We'll bring all our gifts to the table, do what we're able somehow. For we were called for just such a time as now. We were called for just such a time as now.
So thank you everyone for coming to this morning's service. The first of the summer services, the presentation. Dean, thank you for an excellent, excellent job. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, John, for coming. Thank you, Paul, for helping out with the tech. It was a great time of being together, and I'm so glad we could share this.